Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I'm Jessica from Syosset Library, obviously, because this is the library's podcast. And our guest today is
Miro.
And you are the author of Ordinary Monsters, which is the first in the Talons trilogy.
That's right. And I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And this book, first of all, I have to say the ARC of this book, and for those who are not in with the lingo, ARC is Advanced Reader's Copy. Sometimes the publishers will send them out to librarians or, book reviewers, I guess influencers, quote unquote. And I have to say, it was the most beautiful ARC I have ever received, because it came in a box with a letter that was rubber stamped, and it was gorgeous. And immediately, without even knowing much about what the book was about, we're just well, first of all, based on this alone, we know this is going to be awesome, and we certainly have to talk to the author about it. So in your own words, what is Ordinary Monsters about?
Well, sometimes the author is the worst person to ask, because if I could reduce it to something that was a comfortable description, I don't know that it would require 600 pages. I think in a nutshell, I would say it's a story about children with powers in Victorian London who are being pursued by a sinister man of smoke.
That is a beautiful description. And that is a very brief description of the book. So it's called everything from a gas lamp fantasy to historical fantasy. There's a lot of really great things in it. And the characters I loved. You have these children with powers. They're all different ages. Marlowe is, I guess, sort of the first one you really, really meet. As a baby, and he's taken in by somebody who finds him, but there's something different about him. Then there's also Charlie Ovid, who is a young Black man who is sentenced to death for killing a white man, and he's a kid, and he's had a really tough life as well. And Marlowe and Charlie are sort of scouted and taken in for having different powers. And they're introduced to this home where other kids like them are living. And it sort of goes back and forth between the story of the children and also the story of the sinister pursuance and how it all came together. So it was a fun story, but it also it had a lot of heart.
Well, thank you. Everything you just said was such an excellent synopsis of the premise of the book that I really feel maybe I should be interviewing you about the book.
Well, I mean, it's we do consider our podcasts conversations, so we could have it. We could see this more as a conversation, but the characters all together. And I don't really want to talk too much about what the talents are, because I feel like that would just sort of ruin it a little bit for people. But the characters were just all really well-written characters. And there's a lot of empathy that you evoke from all of them, even the ones that are maybe a little bit more sinister. That was just a really nicely woven pattern. So did you know how many children you were going to focus on in this particular book?
I when I sat down to write the book, I didn't have the book. It hadn't been written. The first character I had actually was Alice Quick, the female detective. And she's kind of an interesting character. Some years ago, I had been reading about the Pinkerton Agency, which was the first private detective agency in the world, really. And it was founded by Alan Pinkerton, who was in many ways, not in others, not so much, but in many ways, he was very forward thinking. And he actually he founded this detective agency, kind of invented the idea of the private detective. And he hired some young women to work for him to go undercover, because they could go into, parts of into society, places where his male agents couldn't go. And one of the young women in particular that he hired was a young woman named Kate Warren, who turned out to be one of his very finest agents, one of his closest confidants. She was a very early hire for him, so she worked with him for many, many years. And the intensity of their emotional bond was such that when he died, he had his wife buried on one side of him and Kate Warren buried on the other. So they were very, very close. Now, when Alan Pinkerton died, he left the agency to his sons, William and Robert, and almost their first order of business was to dismiss the female agents or relegate them to desk jobs. And I remember reading this, and I wouldn't say I was surprised by it, but I was somewhat shocked by it. And I just started thinking about those extremely talented, extremely capable, very, very tough women who'd been working for years doing this kind of work, and suddenly being told, there's no more work for you here. And where would they go? Because, there weren't a lot of private detective agencies out there, but the other ones were not hiring women. And Alice kind of emerged out of that research. So I had her first, and I didn't know what to do with her as a character. And then when I had this other idea, which was the premise of Ordinary Monsters, she's kind of just walked into the book and took it over. Marlowe came first, and followed by Marlowe, Charlie close on his heels. Charlie, I see a lot of my son in Charlie, which is how he walked into the pages of the book. But the other children just kind of, sometimes when you're writing, you sit down one day and what comes out completely surprises you. And that's sort of the experience I had coming across these kids.
So when you are talking about the antagonist Jacob,
Jacob
Marber. He was a really interesting story as well. And man, am I dying to just be like, what with but I'm not going to, because people should be reading the book and find out what his situation was. But I loved just the description of him, and he was appropriately menacing. You understood why people wanted to protect Marlowe from him at all costs. When you were writing him, because I feel like villains, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, could be really difficult to write. Like, you don't want somebody to be like a mustache twirler and be like, yeah, I'm going to get those kids with the powers. But you also, you need to make them scary. Did you find that challenging?
First of all, thank you for your kind words about him. And I'm glad that he was effective. There were parts of him that were tricky. My general approach with Jacob was to, view him from the outside, from a great distance. Things are frightening usually until we know enough about them, and then they become simply dangerous, or we begin to be able to understand a little bit the nature of the threat. But the fear comes from the unknown. And so I started with him on the outside, but the longer I sat with him in the book, and the more I looked at him, the more I found myself coming closer and closer to him, until eventually I started getting little windows into his life and how he got to where he was. And once I reached that point, I think Jacob at some point shifts in the novel, at least for me as the writer, from being simply a frightening figure to being a dangerous one, perhaps a misguided or misunderstood one who's taken the wrong path. But then again, that's something that applies to other characters in the book too.
Yes, it does. And I'm curious. So are you finished with the second? And this is definitely going to be a trilogy. Like you have how you see it going from the next book to the finale.
Yes. Yeah. I in some ways I think of it as a single big story. Breaking it into books is an organizing principle, of course, but I couldn't imagine stopping the story before where I feel it needs to go to end. I have a very strong idea about the overarching 3 books. The second book I'm deep in the middle of working on. We're scheduled to put it out next year, and we're on track for that at present. So that's good news. But there's also a lot of things that I found in my experience as a writer that you have to leave unknown and be comfortable with being surprised by. If a book doesn't surprise the writer, then I don't think it'll ever surprise a reader. So there are large swaths of the book where I think I know what I want to do, say in book 3, but I'm comfortable with the fact that when I sit down to actually do it, it probably won't look anything like what I'm imagining.
When did you start writing this book?
Well, I've lived with the story for some years now. The actual sitting down to write this book, when I solved how to tell the story, which was pretty tricky for me for a few years, that happened across COVID. So, the world kind of shut down in February or March for us up here in Canada. And that was about the time that I sat down. I'd kind of reached a stopping point in a different manuscript I was working on where I couldn't really figure out how to move forward. And instead of wasting the time, because we've got 2 young kids at home and writing time is at a premium. So, it feels frustrating to spend a day staring out the window and not producing anything. So I decided to put my attentions into this other manuscript, and I sat down to work on it almost as a way of trying to let the other book percolate. And then this one took off, and it took me about 10 months to produce a first draft, which for me is very, very quick.
Were you a big fantasy reader, like forever? Was this
Yes.
like, this was all, I can tell by your writing just that you have such a love of the genre.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is where I was born as a writer in this world. I when I grew up, I was a very lonely boy, living it was the 80s. There was no internet and there was no way to find kindred spirits. And, I was the kid that was picked on when the kids who were picked on got picked on. They would then pick on me. So I was right at the bottom of the feeding order, through my elementary years. And I found a refuge in books, and those books very quickly were the fantasy novels that were available at the time. So, back then for me, growing up in a small town, it was the mall bookstore is where I would go, and they had Robert Jordan and Terry Brooks and Ted Williams and Anne McCaffrey, and of course Tolkien, and on and on and on. Dragonlance books were big, and I just devoured all of them. I had a lot of time, and I read them, and I loved them. But in grade 6, I had the good fortune to end up in the class of Mr. Balchin, Dave Balchin. He's actually who this book is dedicated to. He was my grade 6 teacher. And he recommended for me, he passed a book to me that I hadn't seen before called The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. And that book really changed my life. I read that book and I knew that I wanted to do it too. I wanted to write books and publish books. And these were the kinds of books I dreamed of. And it's not that I loved that book more than, the other books I was reading. In fact, I might have loved it a little bit less, but I couldn't shake it. I couldn't get it out of my head. There was this mystery at the heart of it that I couldn't explain, which of course is what great literature does, and I ended up leaving that situation behind, and I had a very different adolescence, but I never lost the very clear understanding that I wanted to be a writer, and it all came back to those books. But I ended up becoming a poet and a literary novelist up here in Canada. But I never stopped reading these fantasy books, but they were sort of a refuge for me, this sort of safe space where I would just go as a reader and I could leave the writing part of my brain to one side. And then when we had kids, about 10 years ago, we started reading these stories to children, at bedtime, and our kids, I would watch my children's faces, my daughter and my son, their faces would light up as you would read them these stories. And, literature for kids is almost overwhelmingly imaginative, and something awakened in the back of my brain when I did that. And I was doing that had been lying dormant for a long time. And these imaginative stories started dreaming themselves up in the back of my brain. I didn't know what to do with them for a long time, but that sort of rekindled that in me, and that's where these came from. That's where Ordinary Monsters came from.
Yeah, I have to ask, because you mentioned Dragonlance. Are you a gamer?
No, because
No. Oh my
I
God.
wish.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this. I was in grade 6. There was nobody in my life, in my world, that was like me. It was a rougher school that I went to. I mean, I had 2 brothers who I was very close to. So and I had wonderful parents. So my home life was great, but I had no one else to hang out with. But I desperately wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. And I met this other little boy from, there was a program called the PACE program. And we would get out of school every Wednesday afternoon and go off to this little program to do extra little work. And he also was interested in Dungeons and Dragons, but we were like 11, 12 years old, and we didn't know how to play. And the rules books were, beautiful books, amazing books, but very intimidating for children. And what we really needed was just somebody, a friend who knew, or an older brother who knew, who could say, look, this is how you do it. This is what you do. So I remember going over one afternoon, and we spent the whole afternoon drawing dungeons on graph paper. And it was so much fun. But then after we'd done it, we didn't know what to do with it. We didn't even understand that you needed a dungeon master. Anyway, so no, I never managed to as a kid. But I keep hoping that one day maybe this book will introduce me to a circle of people who will say, hey, what are you doing Friday night? Come over here.
Okay, so you heard it here on Turn the Page. J.M. Miro really needs a party to adventure with. I know a lot of gamers listen to some of our episodes, especially our fantasy ones, because we're big gamers here. J.M. Miro, author of Ordinary Monsters and other books, would love to adventure with you. So
I would love to. I'll be terrible at it, so you'll have to be patient.
It's I didn't start until I was an adult, so there's always a time there's always time to start. But my kids, we play a D6 version with a 6-sided die, not a 20-sided die, with the kids, and my husband is the dungeon master. So I loved the different powers that the kids had within the realm of the talents. And it was so cool. And I was imagining myself like, thinking about just the different types of characters you can play in Dungeons and Dragons, like, this would be really cool. I would love to see this.
Oh, that's so neat. So how old are your kids that are
My
playing?
kids are 7. They turned 7 in April.
Right. Okay. Our son is 7. So how long does a game take?
Oh, you mean when we're playing Hero Kids? Shout out to the author of Hero Kids. You know what? We do it over a period of a few days.
Okay.
Usually, like, we'll do one quote unquote encounter, which if you are listening to this fantasy and you've listened to us talk about this stuff and you don't know what an encounter is, an encounter would be like if your characters run into monsters or enemies, or like a situation even. So usually what we'll do is we'll break down, or my husband will break down the adventure by encounters. So we'll come up to things, and I play, like, both of my boys wanted to be wizards because of course.
Right.
So I play the muscle. I'm playing the warrior to make sure that they don't get completely killed. But what we'll do is there'll be some task they have to complete, and once they complete that, we will save the game for next time, and then next time we will pick it up again. So like it could take anywhere between like 3 half-hour sessions to, if we're doing a longer one, 5 half-hour sessions, but those are very rare. Usually my husband likes to keep them short.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you tell us anything about the next in the series, like a title maybe? And if you're not allowed to, that's fine too.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm not allowed to. I've my publishers have been just incredible as far as being encouraging and supportive and patient with the foibles of a writer. I would say that I'm hesitant to tell you very much about it. I do think that
Sure.
this first book, I hope it's sort of self-contained in and of itself, but it also leaves a few questions. And I can, well, maybe I shouldn't even assure readers, but I can assure readers that my hope is to address those questions in book 2, while also introducing perhaps some new questions.
Excellent. So this book will be available the end of May, right?
June 7th.
June
is launch
7th.
day.
Okay, so it won't be available the end of May. It'll be available the next week.
That's right.
The end of May is when you should go to your library or your local bookstore and say, I would like to reserve this book because I need to read it. Thank you so much. This was so much fun talking to you. I can't wait to see what happens in the next book. Thank you so much to your publishing company for sending the most beautiful ARC we've ever seen. It's Flatiron, which is a subsidiary of Macmillan.
That's right. Yeah.
That's excellent. And yeah, I just hope people love this book as much as I did.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for talking.
Oh, thank you. So once again, this was Jessica with Turn the Page podcast, talking about ordinary monsters and also gaming with your family and becoming a gamer as an adult, with author
J.M. Miro,
who is absolutely looking to join your online Dungeons and Dragons party. So, you know, throwing that out there, this guy needs to play some D&D. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.